I think we will get started because we only have 1 hour for this very interesting brown bag presentation on Zoom. My name is Anna Langer, and I'm a professor of the practice of public health in the Department of Global Health and Population. And I also co-lead the lead fellowship with the Harvard Global Health Institute. So it is my pleasure and my honor to introduce my colleague and friend, Ana Cristina Gonzalez Velez today, and I will say a few words about her. Her CV is really impressive. She's a Colombian medical doctor with more than 25 years of experience. She holds a master's degree in social research in health, as well as a PhD in bioethics. And she's a renowned international expert and leader in the field of health and sexual and reproductive rights, the right to health, and gender equality. Dr. Gonzalez is the former National Public Health Director in Colombia and co-founder of La Mesa por la Vida y la Salud de las Mujeres and the Medical Group for the Right to Decide in Colombia. She pioneered the Causa Justa movement of Colombia that established the most liberal abortion laws in Latin America and the Caribbean. She's also part of the regional coalition Articulación Feminista Marcosur and was recently included as one of the 100 most influential people in the Time 100 list of 2022. We are thrilled to have Ana Cristina as one of our 2022 lead fellows for promoting women in global health, a collaboration, as I said before, between GHP and the Harvard Global Health Institute. So welcome, Ana Cristina, the floor is yours. Hopefully we won't have any technical glitches. Ana Cristina will present for approximately 40 minutes, and then we will have time to engage in Q&A.
Thank you very much, Anna, for your introduction and for your kind words. I'm so happy to be here. I see many people in the conversation, so I hope what I'm going to share is interesting and useful for you and for discussion, of course. I'll start sharing my presentation. Can you see the presentation correctly?
Yes, although, yeah, now it's perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So what I will present, I call my presentation Biolegitimacy and Restrictive Abortion Regulations in Latin America, an Overview and Perspectives. I'm sorry, it's not passing. I organize this outline for the presentation, but is a conversation that is very connected. So I will maybe omit the title sometimes, but this is how I organize the presentation. I want to start giving you some background. The ideas included in this presentation are part of my doctorate dissertation. It is published in the link that then maybe you can consult, and this is a picture of the publication by Peter Lang editorial. This conversation that I propose includes a definition and questioning of restrictive regulations, and in particular to the use of the criminal law to regulate abortion as a health service. I analyze the case in the region where regulations are based on a lower value rating of women's lives. So what I do is that I review restrictive regulations from the notion of biolegitimacy. And I would say that this is not only the case of Latin America, although the regulations that I studied are from Latin America, but I think this is useful also for other contexts. When you review the literature on abortion, you will find lots of argumentative lines, but you can simplify those arguments into main lines, which are the defense of the fetus life as a human person, as I will explain later, and the defense of women's reproductive autonomy and the state's role in the regulation and control of bodies and freedom. But the debate is not approached from biolegitimacy perspective. And from this perspective, the moral economy on abortion, which in this work refers to values, rules, regulations, and laws regulating women's moral life, and in particular its reproduction, expresses different values, degrees of women's life. And those degrees also change or vary according to ethnicity, race, and social class. So this is a very simple thesis, and the thesis can be explained as you can see here. The fetus is the main consideration in abortion restrictive regulations, and legitimacy is conferred as a result of an overvaluation of biological life, the biological dimension of life, which is known also as Zoe in some of the most antique texts that discusses life since Aristoteles. Then the life of women who refuse maternity is considered less valuable than the fetus life. And this value is associated again to biological life. So the final result is that the biographical life or the bios life or the political life is the less valued dimension of life, which is subordinated to biological life. And that's what I'm going to explain during the rest of the presentation. But let me first share some of the ideas of this notion of biolegitimacy, a notion introduced by Fazan, ahead of Foucault's thought. In many works of Fazan, you will see this, for me, very appealing and interesting notion that aims at highlighting a central element of present morality, which is the prominence of the right to life, but as a biological fact, and the prominence over biographical life, which produces physical and symbolic violence, as we will see during the presentation. And this prominence is present in different fields and contemporary debates around health, for example, HIV, or even humanitarian aid. And the right to life is also related to the legitimacy conferred to that piece of life, which is the biological life. And technological developments and advances in genetics have contributed to the overvaluation of life as a biological fact, because they shorten the time of viability and define something that is called in literature as bio-value. And this produces a disruption of life as a whole, and this places justice as a sort of legitimacy. And let me share with you the example through which Fazan explains how this predominance of life displaces justice as a source of legitimacy. And he asked, what has in common Pinochet, Maurice Papon, and Heinz Barth? In fact, the three of them committed the worst abuses of power, but they exercise a brutal sovereignty over the right to live or die over other human beings, but they also shared another interesting destiny or fate, is that the three of them escape the justice due to humanitarian reasons after their lawyers defended the idea that they were too sick to stand or bear the punishment. So the lesson of these three judicial episodes is that the legitimacy over their supposedly threatened to their biological life basically deleted their political life. And this leads to a prominence of suffering of the victims and those who witness the suffering over rights. And you will see all these interlinked with the restrictive regulations that we were going to analyze. Thus, Fazan proposes biolegitimacy as the value conferred to life as a whole. And presently, of course, biology prevails on this idea of life. The features of Fazan's thought from his works on HIV, but also migration, refugees, humanitarian aid, and even his experience with Doctors Without Borders are four main features. The first one is that the centrality of suffering, which confers legitimacy to the actors and to people through this equation of a victim and piety from the one who witnessed the suffering. The second feature is the certification to confer value. So the voice puts in a third party place, or the inequality in the dispute around biolegitimacy and the tension between life and justice, as I already explained. So this moral economy of abortion comes from Foucault ideas around what can be or cannot be done and what must be controlled from biopolitics, and what is regulated in life's order and the assignment of value in the field of morality. A useful notion to understand how abortion regulations are a result of an assignment of value in which legitimacy conferred to women's life is always lower. And this assignment takes place in the field of morality, although it uses the law as a vehicle. So let's look at the restrictive regulations on abortion in Latin America. In the book I published, I use a notion of restrictive regulation halfway between sociology and the law, aligned with authors like Nino, Fernandez, Garcia-Añón, Lemaitre, and Villegas. Regulations understood as statements based on two prescriptive discourses, intrinsically linked, which are morality and law, discourses that together creates normality. Those regulations can be based on positive law or based on practices. And when it comes to practices, I call those informal regulations that are ascribed to a group's social and moral order. And these regulations are an assembly of legal dispositions from positive law and informal regulations from social practices. But they are all coercive, penalizing, punitive, and they create barriers to access services. They limit or restrain access to information or abortion services, and they lay a disproportionate or costly burden on women, but they cannot address women or providers, services, or technologies like misoprostol. And according to severity, prohibitions, and potential effects or damages, they are high-intensity regulations, for example, complete prohibitions, and becoming lower intensity regulations, and you will see. So the formal regulations encompass total penalization, the indications regime, the time limit regime, and the requisites for those regimes, but also requisites for access to technology or regulations of contents of rights, such as information, confidentiality, or privacy. And the informal, the constraining, delaying, or impeding practices regarding services. And among those informal practices or regulations, we will see conscientious objection, obstetric violence, juridical actions against guaranteeing regulations like habeas corpus, as I will explain. So the intensity of these regulations stems from, in the first place, from the variations of the same kind of regulations. So for example, the life exception is regulated in very different ways in different countries. So the risk to life must be, for example, confirmed by 1 or 3 professionals, and these create a different level of burden on women. But the intensity also stems from the active persecution beyond the existing regime or model, or from the degree of conscientious objection in health services. You will find regimes where you are allowed to perform individual conscientious objection or even institutional conscientious objection, and also stems from different degree regulations that might coexist in the same country. So the formal restrictive regulations encompasses criminal law, judicial decisions, sanitary or administrative regulations. They can establish penal, civil, ethical, or social sanctions, like, for example, re-education. They expressively contravene concrete human rights standards when prohibit or restrain with no solid arguments the use of technology, for example, or they demand disproportionate requisites for access but in general terms, they subordinate women's decision to a third party. That can be a physician, a health team, psychologists, judges. And they make up regulation packages that go from crime to regulations of a lower rank, a prohibitions spiral suppressing women. Without exception, in Latin America, abortion is still considered a crime. And in this framework, women are given permission with a more or less restrictive approach to decide on their life project and meet this health need in a context of exceptionality, as is pretty well explained by Penelope Deutscher. So here you can see a list of examples, and we are going to analyze some of these examples in order to be able to explain how these can be analyzed from a biolegitimacy perspective. So we'll see, for example, that the crime of abortion is included in the penal code of all countries, but we will see total decriminalization in countries like El Salvador, or indications regime in countries like Paraguay, Bolivia, or Chile, or time limit regime in countries with differences in those time limits, countries like Mexico, Argentina, Uruguay, or partial decriminalization and persecution of women and providers, or total decriminalization and persecution of women, or other forms of punishment different to prison, like social re-education, or restrictions in the use of misoprostol, or in the right to information, or conscientious objection that is in the limit between the formal and informal laws or regulations, and the 3 examples of informal practices that I will analyze. So the first, let's say, group of formal regulation is the abortion crime, which is the backdrop of abortion legal regimes in our region. In Latin America, we will see an important number of countries with total prohibition, like El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, Dominican Republic, including setbacks to the 90s indications model. And in the penal codes, we will see a wide range of classification of the crime, which says a lot to us about who is in the first place in these regulations. There exists a crime against the person, a crime against the physical and moral personality, like in Uruguay, a crime against life and integrity, the most common type of crime which exists in Bolivia, or more specifically against the inviolability of life in Ecuador, or against the life of a human being in process, like in El Salvador, or against the life, body, and health, like in Peru, or against family order and public morality, like in Chile, or an abortion crime, like it exists in Colombia and Mexico. What are the critical elements of this crime? Penalties are different along the region, in between 1 to 12 years of prison. Penalties can be for women or professionals with the qualification to practice the profession in some countries, or they goes for abortion or attempt of abortion, like is the case of Paraguay, or there are stronger penalties for professionals like in El Salvador or in Brazil, or alternative penalties like service in orphanages, like in Ecuador, or community work or fines in Mexico, but also penalties to other professions like pharmacists, or penalization post-liberalization processes, like was the case of Miranda in Argentina, recently decided in favor of the physician, or the human personhood from conception. Those are some of the critical elements, but also the effective criminalization, which is not exclusive of total criminalization regimes, because there is persecution in cases of fetal loss or obstetric emergency cases, pretty common in El Salvador, with a differential effect, as is called by Oberman, which means that criminalization affects certain groups of women. We have figures from Colombia, very recent figures. Before this recent decriminalization, we were seeing about 400 cases per year of criminalization of abortion, with 25% of juvenile convictions, and convictions between 3 and 7 times higher than those for sexual or domestic violence, and cases and criminalization like concentrated in rural women. But other critical elements related to this has to do with confidentiality breach, disclosure of data from the clinical history and rates in clinics, like, for example, happens in Brazil, or judicialization in different degrees according to the state, which is the case of Mexico, where every state is like a country. And in Aguascalientes, for example, they consider reparation for damages and losses in cases of abortion. And that is like the most extreme regime where abortion is totally banned, but also criminalization that is not linked necessarily to those cases of total ban of abortion. And then we will find the indications regime that has, I would like to highlight 4 edges of this type of regime, and these edges give way to a variety of restrictions again. So first of all, this is a variable model according to indications or known exceptions. So you will find countries that allows abortion only in cases of life risk, like in Paraguay and Guatemala, or in cases of health and life, like in Costa Rica, or in cases of health and rape, like in Argentina, that has a mixed model, as I will explain, or more exceptions, like the case of Bolivia, for example. But this is also a regime that is variable according to requisites for the configuration of the exceptions. So you will find countries where you need authorization by 1 or more physicians, or boards of physicians, or specialists, like the cases of Peru and Mexico, or legal complaint, like in Colombia, or medical certificate. Another feature for this indications regime is the interpretation issues that are more related with health or malformation indications. This is an element that gives way to a broadening of access, but a limitation at the same time, because it circumscribes the exception to approval by an expert. And Argentina is very famous for the FAL case, where before this case decided at court, the rape exception was only applied to idiot or insane women. And in Colombia, this feature has led to a broad interpretation supported by constitutional jurisprudence or by frameworks implemented by civil society. But under this indications regime, there are also applications problems more related to the rape indication. And it has to do with variable requisites that goes from the women's word in Brazil to lawsuit complaint in Panama, or to test or confirmation by a team in Chile. Then we will find the time limit regime, a more guaranteeing model that involves women's will that coexist in most of the cases with abortion crime, in all the cases, I'm sorry, with abortion crime. And after time limit, there are indications or exceptions constituting what we call a mixed model, with also some characteristic elements. First of all, this is variable and arbitrary. The time limits that have been set goes from 8 weeks in Guyana to 12, 14 in Uruguay, 14 in cases of rape, or 14 in Argentina to 24 in Colombia more recently. And indications post time limit are variable and arbitrary and usually related to biological dimension of life. There are requisites to access within the time limit that goes from interdisciplinary teams with OBGYNs, social workers, mental health workers, to the obligation of providing information on abortion alternatives, to periods of reflection or second thoughts of 5 days for women who want to get an abortion. And finally, variability in the application field. And Mexico is the best example we have in the region. They have liberalized abortion in 11 states, but the situation in every state is different, which create inequalities inside the country. But there are other forms of restrictions. So you will find in different countries variable prohibitions for the use of misoprostol, vis-a-vis the use of medication as an alternative to abort and minimize complications. And you will see, for example, exclusive inpatient use in Paraguay, or more recently in Colombia, they included a new restriction which obligates health services to have an emergency service in order to be able to provide misoprostol of mifepristone, or the prohibition of information and publicity on the medicine, constituting violation of the right to information on reproductive health in the case of Brazil, giving women an alternative, which is access to the medicine in the black market. But there are also restrictions to concrete rights contents to demand or motivate the complaint by the professional when abortion is suspected, against the protection of professional secrecy, and to break professional secrecy, which is the case of Ecuador, or explicit duty to violate confidentiality, like is the case of Peru. And then we will find conscientious objection, which is an example of restriction in between the formal and informal regulation or practices. Is a kind of passage regulation norm, because it exists in some countries. There are formal regulations around conscientious objection that, for example, in Uruguay, creates disproportionate protection to professionals committed to the defense of human life, meaning the human life of the fetus. And it includes, for example, administrative staff possibility to become objectors, or it can be exerted without limits, or the case of Chile, where the Constitutional Court recognized institutional conscientious objection. But where it's not regulated, or even where it is regulated, it exists an abusive practice in a wide variety of countries. And more than an objection, it constitutes obstruction to access health services. And these take place in spite of guaranteeing or protective frameworks, like is the case of Colombia, or is extremely high between OBGYNs, 40% in Brazil, and in almost 80% in the same country of the cases, the women's worth requesting an abortion due to rape is questioned, and they object, doctors, the procedure if it doesn't agree with the gestational age. And then you will see informal regulations or practices that grow under the umbrella of informal rules. They naturalize punishment and stigma. They delay or hinder access, and they encompass issues of interpretation, legal uncertainty, incorrect application, and non-specificity. So where there's regulation, there will be informal regulations or practices. And I just want to call your attention on 3 examples. One is the case of habeas corpus in Brazil, where a church representative by a judicial authorization stops an abortion for anencephaly that had been authorized by a judicial to a woman. So an individual action is supported by the state. Or the case of interruption of abortion through judicial via, again in Uruguay, where a judge assigned a court-appointed attorney for a protection action demanded by women's partner, which is illegal in the country, and they appointed a lawyer for the fetus. This case was decided at the end of the day against the judge that created this situation. And there is a more generalized practice, which is obstetric violence, a group of practices encompassing suboptimal care because of the use of obsolete procedures in high complexity institutions, contrary to technical indications, or systematic doubt around the women's worth in rape cases, as I already explained. So what's the role of biolegitimacy in all these restrictive regulations? What I saw is that biolegitimacy can work as a grill or matrix to understand restrictive regulations and the moral economy of abortion, with all these features that I describe here, and that I will go in depth through some of them. So first of all, what we can see in these restrictive regulations in moral economy, we can see that life order is regulated by the assignment of a moral value, and that these restrictive regulations expresses the legality record of this moral economy in an order that confers less legitimacy to women who refuse maternity, but where the practice of abortion, but women, regardless of the legal framework, prohibitions or risk, is also part of this moral economy, because we are not inactive in this moral economy. And abortion regulations seem confusing in the framework of exceptions, making sovereignty over the body a territory in dispute between women and a sovereign alternative power, which is the state and its representatives. So we can see clearly the preponderance of biological life and the fetus value, because abortion regimes in Latin America are organized around the value conferred to prenatal life, to the fetus, or biological life. It supports the existence of the abortion crime and is expressed in different legal models, but it's also reflected in the different type of abortion crimes that I described to you. This protection is a limitation to women's freedom, and it creates a division between the fetus and the woman, the fetus as a separate and independent entity, every time with a shorter space due to technology. And it creates also a deliberate confusion between life and person, because anti-rights are always talking about the rights of the fetus, and if the persons are the ones who have rights, so the fetus is a person. But you can see also that women's lives exist under a kind of biological citizenship. So prenatal life is the reference point to identify high-rank interest forces, formal and informal regulations to limit the essential content of the protection of women's rights. And the value of women's lives derives, as you saw in the regulations, from their biological dimension through the indications or exceptions, including terms or notions like life, risk, health, fetal malformation. And this rating of biology is nurtured by physical suffering. It values it, and it depends on others' interpretation of medical concepts or notions. And this value is attested by the physician, which is witness the suffering. And as a consequence, there is an absence of life as a biography. Time limits state a time period when women can decide autonomously the value, and it confers a value of biographical life, and it grows under this regime. And because it also reflects the entry of personal will, but in a very fragile way, because time limits are supervised by other people, as I explained, support teams or reflection times, second thoughts time limits. They're determined in an arbitrary way, and models are always combined with exceptions that again put us under the protection of this biological life. The regulations on abortion are heteronomous. They subordinate women to decision of others. They are based on legal paternalism, because a prohibition implemented to protect people from immoral behaviors damaging others. And this is the case of a woman judge in Uruguay, or the prohibition of information in Brazil. And moreover, restrictive regulations subordinate women to live life as biology. And the consequences fall over some groups of women: the poorest, that are prosecuted and imprisoned, the youngest, indigenous or Afro women with less possibilities when there is total prohibition or even exceptions, and they strengthen already existing inequalities, so their lives with lower value. And the lower value conferred to women's life, to their biological life, and to certain life dispossesses women from the rights, precarizing reproduction. So they dispossess it through a circular mechanism: less legitimacy of their lives, less biolegitimacy precarizes them and deprives them from the rights. The supremacy of biological life over biographical life represents the victory of the right to life in its narrowest and less human version. And restrictive regulations express a victory over justice by creating a particular moral economy, establishing precariousness. And precarization, again, produces inequality and disadvantages, but also insecurity. For example, arbitrary interferences, as the case of habeas corpus, or justice or restrictive interpretations of indications. In sum, what we witness here is the imposition of a moral economy of biolegitimacy in abortion that underestimates women's biographical life, and especially the life of those women who refuse maternity. And the device of this economy is restrictive regulations that become its legality record. So in terms of perspectives for action, it is necessary to reverse this subordination of women's biographical lives through an inverse exercise, starting with the protection of the interest with a higher rank, which is women's rights. And this implies to entrust the embryo fetus to the women's moral decision. And this freedom makes women's body immune to the conflict women fetus. A right for two, as is called by Tamar Peach, where fetal life protection is ensured when women decide the fetus can be born, reinforcing protection to wanted pregnancy, and protection of life, meaning freedom to choose a life project for every woman, a right without criminal law. So for this, in order to recognize biolegitimacy, we should eliminate abortion crime from penal codes, eliminate restrictions that uses the state punitive power, making abortion a paradigmatic case of exceptions. And it would allow for the restoration of biolegitimacy in the moral economy of abortion, conferring value to biological and biographical life, bringing justice, recognizing freedom, allowing for abortion to be considered a health service, and regulating abortion outside the criminal field with regulations that can guarantee access and the elimination of barriers, and transforming the terms of the debate. A right without criminal law, because ethically it's not possible to maintain regulations informed by the underestimation of women's life, is just not fair. Thus, biolegitimacy could be an alternative in the dispute for the liberalization of abortion because it places women's lives in the center. That is what we did in Colombia when we opened a public debate to question the use of criminal law, when we filed the Causa Justa lawsuit in 2020. And this lawsuit was decided by a judgment of the Constitutional Court, eliminating the abortion crime until 24 weeks. And after this time limit, in 3 exceptions with no gestational age limit. And it was not totally eliminated, but the crime became obsolete because it was already inefficient, counterproductive, discriminatory. But today, practically, it doesn't exist, although it exists in the penal code, and creating the conditions for the elimination of the crime in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for a very, very exciting and thought-provoking presentation. Now we have some time for questions and comments. And maybe I will start with a very basic one, and sorry for the ignorance, but I don't fully understand how in countries where abortion has been decriminalized or even legalized, the crime of abortion is still in the penal code. That seems to me, as a simple public health professional, like a contradiction. I don't know how that happened. And then a second thought that I had while you were talking is, what's the role of enforcing those penal codes, or those, the punishment associated with an abortion for both providers and women? Because, well, we know that in some countries, like countries in Central America, the laws are quite often enforced and people end up in jail, while in other countries, the laws exist and the crime exists in the penal code, but it's not really enforced.
Thank you, Anna, for your questions. Well, your first question is exactly the point of this whole conversation, because what we've seen in most of the countries globally, but I can speak for sure in Latin America and the Caribbean, we have this kind of dual situation where we have exceptions through time limits, indications, or those are the basic models, or the mixed one. And at the same time, we keep the crime of abortion in the penal code. And it happened recently in Colombia. So we still have the crime of abortion, although we decriminalize abortion up to 24 weeks. So this is exactly the contradiction that we need to finally discuss and make people clear about this particular feature of abortion. One of the few countries in the world that eliminated or repeal abortion crime from the penal code is Canada. So there are not many examples. We have some states in Australia, we have the case of New Zealand, but the crime of abortion exists. And in my view, and that's what I try to do through this work, is that's the main reason by which this continues to be a highly complicated and difficult discussion in our countries. And then about enforcing, what I can say is that, of course, the situation in Central America is one of the worst I think in the world. But what is true is that this is not anymore a symbolic crime. We thought that in Colombia, for example, and we saw in a study that we conducted with information from the General Attorney Office, is that this is not anymore a symbolic crime. So since 2006, when in Colombia abortion was decriminalized under 3 circumstances by the first time, we've seen a growing of criminalization cases since that moment. So we've seen, as I mentioned, 400 cases, and we don't have women in jail, but those women are stigmatized as criminals because it is in your judiciary pass. I don't know if you have that type of document in other countries, but we do have if you want to get a job, you have to go and look for your criminal records. And
it
so
will show there.
Yes.
Thank you. Please feel free to ask any questions or make any comments by raising your electronic hand or your physical hand. I will try to recognize the questions and comments from the audience. No questions. Okay. Okay. Since there aren't any other questions, I will ask one more, if you don't mind. You made a brief allusion to religious institutions or the role that a priest had played in Brazil. But I wonder if you want to say a little more about the role of religious institutions like the Catholic Church in Latin America and some of the Christian churches that have been becoming increasingly active and powerful in Latin America, and well, the role they play in creating these the tensions that you referred to, and contributing to the violation of women's rights.
Well, I'm not an expert on these issues, but I think that I would like to mention at least 3 features that I've seen that have changed in their activism around abortion. And one of those was very clear for me in Colombia. They didn't really took part of the public conversation around abortion because they don't have that much arguments. So they're still saying that we need to protect the fetus and the fetus is a person. That's basically the main argument they use. And the other one is that abortion has terrible consequences on women's health. But they didn't took part of the conversation around arguments, while we developed and deployed 90 arguments from public health, comparative law, and many other type of arguments. They just didn't took part, but they have, instead of that, they have been using procedural tools from the law to try to reverse what we gain or what we got in the Constitutional Court, for example. So now the court is studying around 17 requests for nullities to our sentence. And they are also trying to call a referendum. So they are using like the most political or procedural tools that the law gives to them in this fight. On the other side, they have become very powerful in countries like, for example, Brazil. They are not anymore Catholics. They are other churches. And they are working in a very close way with parties. So we've seen in our region, I would say, in a gross way, how they are participating in the political debates, and they're defending the position of the church, like in, I don't know, in the 15th century. But they are doing this through some of the most conservative parties, putting like their principles in the center of this conversation. And the third thing I would say is that there's still this separation between the church as an institution and what Catholics do with their lives. When they need to have an abortion, they are going to pursue the abortion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Last chance for questions and comments. If there aren't any at this point, we will thank Ana Cristina for a wonderful presentation. In my case, in particular, well, abortion is one of the key topics I worked on forever. So your thoughts are and your experience are well, really enlightening, and I very much appreciated and enjoyed your presentation. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for you. I would love to hear more from people, but I understand also.
There's actually a great question in the chat.
Oh, I didn't see it. Olivia, go ahead, please.
So Patty Gonzalez asked how to accelerate the political conversation in country where OBGYN and lawyers don't do activism on the topic.
Well, in my experience, one thing that has been very powerful recently is that we have created these groups of doctors for choice, like in a way following the example from the United States. And we have a network that has now presence in Colombia, Brazil, Mexico, and we can of course do something in Peru. Patty, I think I know who you are, but I think that it's been very powerful because in general terms, doctors doesn't take part of public conversations, but then they are consulted as the experts in the field. So one of the things that we have experienced is that we can still continue being the technical voices and voices that uses evidence and relation with women and the difficulties they experience when they need to access an abortion service, while at the same time we prepare those doctors to be more active in public conversations. So I think that basically we need to organize in those kind of groups and exchange strategies. And I've seen in Colombia how doctors have changed and how they have, I don't know, become much more public, and it's been so interesting and exciting.
Thank you. You also got a congratulatory comment from a former lead fellow, Maureen Luba, saying very insightful. Thank you so much for sharing. Any further comments and questions? Of course, you can also use the chat function. Okay, well, thank you all. Thank you, Ana Cristina, again. Enjoy the rest of the day and have a great weekend.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye now. Bye.
Bye.